Uh, we're going to be speaking with William Stafford today, and we're going to be discussing most of the poems that have been recently published in his new and collected poems, Stories That Could Be True. Welcome to Arcata.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with a small quote from one of your poems and from an essay that you've written and ask you what you think of it. The quote goes like this: "It is too late now for earlier ways. Now there are only some other ways, and only one way to find them: fail." And in an essay on Richard Eberhart, you say, reality demands objection. You prove you're real by failing. And then elsewhere, we are somehow vowed to poverty. A perfect flower blooms from all failure. I wondered if you'd just tell me a little bit about what you mean by failure.
I feel in writing that to be ready to do something other than succeed is an important way to be, that you can't guarantee what's going to happen in art or in life. So another way to put this probably would have been to be reckless, to be, or if you wanted to put it the positive way, be courageous. Be ready for what you're trying not to work out. If you're always careful, then you won't be doing those things that are essential in art. That'd be one of my responses.
You speak a great deal about being a wanderer, especially in the new poems. The idea of the poet and the human being as a wanderer recurs. Does that have the same connotations?
Well, you throw several of my most cherished attitudes into a state of emergency when you say this. And I suppose that's a good they should be thrown into a state of emergency. For this, I can say it, I think, neatly enough, though not adequately enough. I usually think of myself as a person who's not alienated. I don't want to be alienated. I want to belong where I am and not make alienation a policy by any means. Try to reach people. But as a matter of fact, I often do feel a wanderer, and I often feel failure. I feel that I'm a part of a time and part of a culture in which certain endeavors that ought to be tried prevalently fail. Peace would be one of the things I'd like. I would like to guard the environment, but I don't want to take the stance of being alienated by policy. So this may seem a little complicated, or maybe you can see why I'm thrown into the state of emergency.
Oh, I can. I've jumped on you with these questions. You were a conscientious objector during World War II.
That's right.
And actually you were in the CCC camps in California and Arkansas, I believe.
That's right. I was in for 4 years in various camps as a conscientious objector. And again, I feel haunted by this long past of mine that maybe I was conditioned in those years to be ready for failure and to be ready for these causes that don't apparently win. I deliberately put in that apparently. Actually, whenever we're not at war, we're at peace. So the peacemakers have prevalently won. But we're haunted by a feeling of emergency and need in our time. So maybe that early experience of mine, way back in the early 40s, conditioned me to feel always a little apprehensive in this world.
There are many poems that you write that are either about Indian mythology or in the voice. For example, Report to Crazy Horse.
Yes.
Is that a persona poem, or is that in your voice?
The short answer would be it's a persona poem. But then there's another little question back of that. How come that persona so often says wanderer? How come that persona so often says failure? And how come that persona so often is in a certain kind of weather and so on? When I write, I have the feeling of being ready to adjust to the opportunities that show up in the act of writing. I'd like to settle that position. Then say something that might seem like a contradiction, and that is, nevertheless, feeling free, I often find myself going into that report to Crazy Horse persona. And I feel fairly comfortable inside that persona. It's just that it doesn't exactly fit, but it fits pretty well. I don't know if it's possible. I mean, if you'll let me get away with saying this. I sort of belong there, but there are some other possible attitudes to take, though not Crazy Horse's position.
Was your father of American Indian
He
background?
always told us so. But on the other hand, many of the relatives didn't believe him. And so it's kind of a joke in our family. But that's what he said. Remember, Bill, we're Indian.
Your father, often when you write about your father, you write about his incredible capacity for listening. And
Yeah.
There's a poem by that name, and there's, I believe, an elegy for your father in which you tell about going into a field at night, and he listens or leans into his listening, and you hear the cry of a windmill, I believe. And,
I do remember that one, yeah.
but often there's this, your poems come to these moments like the lizard waiting on the desert, these moments of intense stillness in which the world is listening to hear and trying to hear something, and very rarely does the listener hear in the poems. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk at all about the difference for you between listening and actually hearing. It might have something to do with your father, too, I'm not sure.
Yes. Well, I thought of one thing to say I hope won't be distracting, and that is the idea that in a way my father is a persona. I mean, that listening father is partly like my father, but it's also an idealization of something I feel a need for in life, and that is to be able to pick up from the world the signals it's giving us. I feel like a person a limited being in a complex world in which my circuits are being overloaded by possibilities, but I'm doing my best to tune in what I can. And I think this is the stance of many, many people. It shows up a certain way in my poems, but my assumption is that any person who's in the business of understanding is in this same position that's set forth in my poems. And in one of my poems, I have my father say something like the greatest riches of all is to look around and understand. And I sort of learned that curiosity from him, I think.
I was wondering, there's something about the act of listening and of leaning into the world by listening that implies, of course, that there's a great distance.
The listening doesn't always imply hearing, and if it doesn't always imply hearing, it implies either deficient hearing or faintness of the signal, or if you want to stay with that, there would be other sort of images. But to stay with that for a minute, I conceptualize a condition in life in which all of us fail to hear. Some people claim they hear everything there is. I don't believe that. I mean, maybe that's too abrupt, but I don't live in that kind of world.
Do you structure your own books? Or I've heard that perhaps that you don't do that as much as some other poets might.
I think that the summary that you give is correct, that I don't structure them as much as other poets do. It's partly because what's all happened to me with all the main books, again, maybe all the books that I've sent out, I sent them out tentatively. This is another word, I realize, tentative. I have a tentative pattern, but I have some more poems, a lot of other poems. And I'm ready to learn, if I can, from anybody's reaction about the book. So I could say two things, maybe close this out in a hurry, or to open up where it might go on. It's true that they're tentative, but it's also true that almost always they have been accepted very close to my tentative formulation.
when you say someone else structures the book, is that someone else's doing?
No, that's probably my own. When I was structuring the book, I don't think ever anyone has established the main units in the book. I was thinking about, sometimes they've objected to certain poems. Oh no, Bill, you can't do that. And okay, here's another poem.
In the new book, or in the new poems in this book, they seem to be translated into ethical or moral terms, you know, believing, being good, living, learning to live in the world, and then whispered into the ground, returning to the earth. But it seems to be the same structure in each book, but this seems to have been sort of reported into a moral context. Do you feel that that's a new development?
I don't feel that it is, though I want to stop myself and not rebel against it for reasons that aren't good. It might be a perception, but I guess what I can contribute is my feeling. Even moral statements in poems are poetic statements to me. For instance, to choose another poet, and one solid enough to give some weight to this, Wordsworth has often been identified with taking these extreme moral positions. I've always felt about Wordsworth's poems that even the morals are part of the poetry, that it may seem to some readers that he's using poetry for moral purposes. I think he's using morals for poetic purposes.
Yes.
And in my own books, I feel often, confessing to you as another human being, that I'm using the morality or the moral statements or the apparent moral statements actually for poetic purposes.
People talk about, well, Yeats is famous for having said the intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel that that's a true dilemma?
No. No, I am familiar with this stance that Yeats takes, and implicitly, many writers around us apparently are taking that stance, and they're opting nobly to benefit mankind by not perfecting the life. Well, if you accepted what Yeats said as something other than just a poetic, interesting juggling act with words, I take it to be a juggling act with words. I don't accept it as at all coercive intellectually. That I cannot understand how a person's effectiveness, a person's thinking, the trajectory of a person's life can be distorted for the benefit of work. I would think that the product, our perceptions, our hearing, our understanding, these things work best in a balanced, healthful life with plenty of vitamins and a kind of even rectitude of conduct. I have a feeling that many writers have lost out as a result of even entertaining the possibility of Yeats being right.
Are teaching and writing, do you think, separate, very separate endeavors, or are they in some way different aspects of the same thing? I know that you stopped teaching after a certain amount of time.
Yes.
And I heard a wonderful story about how at the end of your teaching career, you actually had decided to no longer grade papers or even put any marks on them. You would just read the students' papers and then return them to them as you had received them, and refusing to make any kind of judgment.
Yes, actually, though this gets pretty complex, that happens to be true, literally true, but I thought that was teaching, good teaching. In fact, we could get into that sometime. So that story about the end of my teaching was just about learning how to teach, I think, rather than giving up teaching. But back to the main question, about the relation between teaching and writing. At first, the way you phrased it, I was ready to say, well, I think teaching is just like some other job you can do. It's a clean, well-lighted place, and you put in so many hours, and then you can do with the rest of your life what you want to do, and that could be writing, or it could be skiing, or whatever. But then when you said, are they too nearly related, or something, I think maybe they are too nearly related. I begin to feel too much reverberation between teaching literature and writing literature. So when I was teaching literature, I made a principle for myself that I wouldn't read just for the courses I was teaching. Because if you read literature for a purpose, it turns into something that's not literature, I feel. If you're reading out of a sense of duty, that's not the stance to take about art. And so that's a hazard for teachers. What they really love, if they love literature, turns into something they do only as a duty, and that would be very sad. So I have two reactions. One is if you don't feel overwhelmed by teaching, if all your reading doesn't turn into duty, it's a job that you can do, and it's a nice place. Usually a campus is, or school. So I didn't feel acute unrest, but I feel a little unrest when you talk about the nearness of those two. I think they are sort of near.
How about teaching creative writing or teaching poetry writing? Do you think that that's damaging to the many poets nowadays who are making their living doing that?
Well, I have two responses to that. One is, what actually happened in my life was that I tried to avoid teaching creative writing. And I could do that where I was teaching. I was mostly teaching literature. I was teaching begin comp or something like that. I know many poets who naturally teach creative writing. I mean, in fact, even the question comes up because it's sort of odd, to be a poet and then not teach it. So in my own life, I tried to keep from it. But in terms of theory, I can't. In fact, I do indulge myself, and I go to writing workshops and teach them on occasion. But I can't, in theory, see any great hazard if it's done right. I'm sort of harking back to what you said about passing judgment. I think there should be retained in every person's life in art the freedom to do it the way you want to do it. And that a very precious thing for a writer or a person in any art is that willingness to follow on to the end of the way that you see yourself. You must be ready to fail, to hark back to one of the early things we talked about. You must be ready for it not to be approved by a teacher or a critic or your society. There are artists all over the world, who are all over the world because they couldn't stay at home because they couldn't be approved by their society. So I think that's a precious thing, and you should retain it. If you judge someone else's work quickly in a class, if you make them feel that they're writing in order to be approved, you're violating what art is about, so it seems to me. And that's a real hazard.
Yes, it really is. Let's see, back to my papers here. One thing that I wanted to ask you is, often in your poems there are clearly metrical forms that you're working in, and then in some poems there are metrical forms that seem to be abandoned, or say in a poem like Traveling Through the Dark, and I'm not at all sure that you're conscious of this when you're working on them. It'll start out in accentual syllabic meter, and then it will, often at the moment of moral choice, where moral choice is presented in the poem, or where the crux is arrived at, the meter is abandoned or loosened, or sometimes it'll just become accentual, or it'll disintegrate, and sometimes the rhyme scheme will do something not unlike that. Is that something you do consciously?
For one thing, you make me aware of something I'm quite ready for. Besides failure in general, I'm ready for particular failures for a purpose. And those would be places in which language, which comes to us spontaneously when we talk, comes to us in distorted ways, sometimes under pressure of emergencies. I would be quite willing for the language to stay true to possibility rather than pattern. I just thought of putting it that way, maybe to go back and pick up later.
Mm-hmm.
But and I'd just like to hold that for a minute. It could, if anything special is happening, something special may be happening in the language. That would be all right. I would be willing for it to disintegrate or whatever. If it disintegrated at certain places, that would have a meaning, just by definition. And it's one of the things to do, or to let happen. But there's another thing I'd like to get at, and that is the metrical patterns are, for me, opportunities and almost inevitabilities, and even when I say it, almost inevitabilities in language, I think I'm sort of acting it out while I say it. Those things will be there. And so I turn the need for pattern around like this and say, the language does not have occasional opportunities for us to put in enrichments like rhyme, alliteration, echoey sounds, various kinds, like regularities. It has everywhere bonuses lying around. Sometimes to pick up one, you have to drop another. So that if a person is analyzing someone's language and says, look at this flaw, they don't notice that you've just picked up a $5 gold piece by dropping something here. I don't like to do this in images like that. But what I mean is, I guess, that the opportunities in language are so much richer than any critic's screen that he puts down, that a writer sees goodies along the way and picks them up, I think.
What I think I was getting at was that it seemed like the moral dilemma that takes place in the poems is sort of acted out by the meter, and in a really moving way, that the extreme regularity is often at the beginning, and then there are these moments in which the choice has to be made by which the narrator, in a way, finds out who he is. And when that happens, the meter abandons a certain amount of its regularity. And I was just wondering if that was conscious when you were working on it.
Yeah, it's awfully hard for me to tell I guess it's all right to use these words, what's conscious or what's unconscious when I'm writing. Because if I look back, I feel, yeah, I sort of knew what I was doing. But at the time I'm doing it, I'm not doing it by rule or by deciding I'm going to do it a certain way. I'm just sort of, this is tennis stroke now, it's just sort of following through a lot of practice. And then I could go back and study the motion of the racket and say, yeah, I took the right curve there. But I didn't think while I was doing it, I just did it.
Do you think that poets that are writing nowadays are handicapped by not having at least trained themselves early on in their writing careers to write more formally?
I'm afraid that the apparent freedom that would be achieved through the practice of strict forms would be the management of strict forms and the occasional relaxation of strict forms, whereas the freedom I would crave for myself and would like to induce in students is freer than that. I mean, it's arrived at not by a relaxation from stern practice, but from a free plunge into opportunities. And if we're not careful as teachers, I feel, we'll make writers feel, student writers feel, that writing is a hazardous kind of occupation. It's full of booby traps. It can be done only if you do it carefully after mastering certain fundamentals, which I have mastered. You know, I put my hand on the students' heads. I've mastered these things. You go and do likewise. I think a much better way is for them to get the appetite for the happy closures that come with using language that satisfies the self. So, in a way, I'm dancing away from this. I don't know. I've done a lot of reading in regular forms, writing in regular forms, all kinds of study. I'm freighted with all this. after so many years, but I feel buoyant. I feel that I'm not relaxing from that I have made an end run around it and found the pleasure that there is in picking up opportunities in talk or in writing. Is it, I'm making a distinction here?
Did you, were you influenced by Hardy in your reading?
Well, several times people have asked me about the current poets I like. I say Thomas Hardy. That's about far enough back to put a little spice into this. And I do like Hardy. But I think we're all influenced by everything around us. And I feel more influenced by talk than by any writing, and more influenced by immediate people in my life than by any writer, no matter how great. I mean, I can't imagine a writer great enough, and I've said this before, but I can't imagine a writer great enough to be as influential as my mother on my language. My language is her language. And I think what is one of the dangers for us in the arts is we forget the great surging background of our lives that's really shaping us, and we focus because it's in a classroom or it's on a page, and we say, I'm influenced by T.S. Eliot. Meanwhile, you're totally steamrollered by the society around you, and your attention has been jiggled onto this arbitrary influence, but the actual influence is much bigger.
Have you ever gone through a period where you've been unable to write?
No, I never have. I never have experienced any kind of slowdown. It's partly because I don't see writing as a difficult thing. It's full of excitement. It's like asking a downhill skier, "Did you ever have skiing block?" Well, when I had a broken leg, maybe, but otherwise, no.
Your poems often are an attempt to define a kind of stillness that's achieved, that's not readily found. And then you have another kind of poem that you write, which is an attempt on the part of a narrator to define themselves through a moral choice. Mm-hmm. And it's as if when you talk about readiness in your poems, it's as if action, when it's taken, is somehow evidence of a kind of readiness rather than an attempt to define what's good and what's bad in the world. It's almost as if what's good and what's bad or right and wrong is secondary, and the ability to experience one's capacity to act and one's readiness for action is what's being talked about.
There was an image on this campus when I came on. I went in the library. That's the first devout call, to pay my devotions. I go in the library first. And as I was coming out, there was a dog waiting. Wonderful dog. His ears were up. Its master was in there somewhere. I just noticed this dog is the most wonderful thing I saw. Everyone who came out, maybe that would be it. Well, I have that feeling in art of maybe this is it. Maybe this is it. If you lose that, then the radar is just turned off. That's all. So it's just like being turned off, ready for what's.
Reminds me of your poem about the Eskimo national anthem, which goes, as you say in the poem, somebody maybe.
Yeah, there's a lot of maybe in many of those poems. The acceptance of limits, because they're there, but the possibility of accomplishment, because it's there, if you don't make the standards so stiff that you run out of gusto for doing it. So this is a kind of a complex little set of tensions that go on in one's life. And some people get one of those tensions too high. They expect too much of themselves, so they're discouraged, so they have writer's block. Or maybe there are people who fall into other dangerous, scary to me and all of us things, patterns of life that ruin their health or their alertness. And then they may use some bad guide like Yeats, who said the perfection of the life or of the art.
Thank you, Mr. Stafford.
It was fun to be here.